The airline said, we want female flight attendants and attractive ones. We're going to dress them in hot pants. And now, suppose they really did get more customers. Is it a legitimate customer preference to want a scantily clad flight attendant?
But I wouldn't make that judgment in terms of having the government come in and intervene, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable business proposition.
Should there be a law preventing companies from hiring people based on whether they're good looking or not? Take the example of Abercrombie. Who can tell us what Abercrombie sells or what it's like in there? Ryan?
It's a clothing store. They sell upmarket clothes, and they're generally focused on a very polished, upscale look. The reason why it's controversial is that they're known to hire extremely attractive models and store clerks, which is consistent with their brand image.
To model the clothes or to sell the clothes?
Both.
Nicole, how would you characterize the people who sell the clothing?
Tall, largely white and blonde-haired. From what I've seen, they not only choose really attractive people, but a certain type of attractive person.
And how would you describe kind of a
preppy look? Yeah.
There was a discrimination complaint against Abercrombie for employment discrimination based on looks. Lookism, I suppose you might call it. Should there be a law against stores like Abercrombie hiring people based on their looks? Matthew, you're unsure.
I'm just worried about the rights of the company to employ the kinds of people they want. The people who are not employed can find work elsewhere.
If it was a business where hiring people of a certain makeup is very fundamental, then I would make exceptions.
But what would an example of a clear case be, where it's okay, in your view, to discriminate based on physical appearance because physical appearance, attractiveness is so fundamental to the job?
So an example for me would be modeling certain clothing. Some clothes are built to fit certain body types, for example.
So in hiring models, it's okay to discriminate based on looks, but in hiring people to sell in a retail store, it's not?
If it's fundamental to the actual purpose and role of the job, then I say it's okay. But in the case of being a salesperson, where the job can be performed by people regardless of their physical stature, then no, I don't.
Ellie?
As a model, your merit is how attractive you are. Your merit is how good you are at staying thin and looking after your skin. And I think that in those circumstances, then we have to have a free market in what people look like. But I think in terms of being a doctor or being a teacher, or I think the Abercrombie example is that grey line.
Well, I disagree with Jamie and with Ellie too about the point that some people should be hired based on their attractiveness. Where would you draw the line between jobs that are required to be attractive and are not?
But I think there are clearly examples where you would have to allow discrimination based on looks. And for example, the acting industry. It would be very difficult to function if you could not discriminate based on how an actor looks and how they can achieve that role.
Nicole?
I think that if you want to change norms in our society about what beauty looks like, then you have to stop doing things like that. Abercrombie sells this look because they're already discriminating. They don't sell appropriate sizes. Their CEO calls people fat all the time and says he doesn't want them in their stores. The two practices are clearly related.
So you want the law against lookism to combat bad attitudes in the society?
Yes.
There are various traits that employees have, and nobody complains if you hire people who are smarter or physically more productive, and I think physical attractiveness is really analogous to those other things.
To intelligence?
Definitely analogous to intelligence, and they can both be important in terms of making the business more effective, attracting customers, and they're kind of equally unfair in terms of how they're distributed unequally among the population.
So if someone is turned down for a job at Abercrombie because they don't have the look, is it unfair to them?
Well, it's unfair in some sense. It's unfair because they didn't have the basic endowment or enough of it, and I say that could be intelligence just as much as physical attractiveness. I think it's better if the government allows the market to operate, and then if you don't like the outcomes in terms of the distribution of income, for example, I think it's better to attack that directly through transfer programs and basic social safety net, those kinds of things.
My instinct would be that employers get to hire people who will be good at doing their jobs. And so I would expect Harvard to have a bias in favor of professors who are smart. The Boston Celtics very disproportionately hire tall people. I would think it was reasonable to hire people who are more successful in selling clothes. I suspect there are certain physical characteristics that are a bit more associated with economic success than others, and I don't think that's something that would be easy to remedy by law.
You mentioned height. I think some studies have shown that tall people make more on average than short people, maybe 10% more, something like that. Is that unfair?
Unfair or not, you're going to observe that in any market economy, indeed in any society, that the distribution of rewards is unequal. I would be much more worried if there was a characteristic that had a strong relationship to what people earned that didn't have any relationship to their effectiveness in doing their jobs, and there is a greater tendency for people who are taller to be able to exercise leadership. And so if they're rewarded for that, that's not something that would trouble me.
They might be selling a fantasy. And people might be, it's almost like going to the movies. Most people do not want to see a sad ending. For that 2-hour window, they are catapulted into some sort of a fantasy land. And it's the same way the fashion industry, they are selling a fantasy, and people are drawn into their shops for that reason.
But isn't that objectionable on the grounds that the people are being objectified?
We're making a value judgment, right, about whether those people are good looking or not. The reason that these businesses are choosing those people is because they believe they can sell more products. Do I, from the very pure lens of economics, think there's something objectionable about it? No. If people are adults and they're making those choices, then I don't see why the heavy hand of the law needs to step in and say they can't do that. However, from a moral standpoint, it's sort of the debate around prostitution. I don't really like the idea, but I can rationally get my head around it.
Is it Abercrombie's role to reflect this higher view that we have of how people should be perceived in terms of beauty? In the end, they're selling clothes so that they can make profits and they can distribute the profits how they want.
Why does that have to be the only goal?
Likewise, if somebody was hiring sales associates and they simply argued, yeah, we only hire white, attractive, 6'1" females because they get better sales, I would argue that that's discriminatory, and their basis might entirely be profit, but altogether that's incorrect. What if somebody hired exclusively white people just because they got more business?
But
that would also be discriminatory.
Were these people qualified? Because then
we all know for any given job, lots of people are qualified. And often the distinction is made between small and small differences, right?
I think the problem might be whether or not it's explicitly stated that this is the policy.
What's the difference between explicitly stated and acting?
We hire attractive people and being proud of that, as opposed to hiring attractive people because they're more likely to close a sale.
So if they announced it in advance, the policy, if they put a sign in the window, no ugly people need apply, then it would be okay.
Yes, because I as a consumer probably wouldn't want to shop there anyway.
Exactly.
And suppose they put a sign announcing in advance, no African Americans need apply.
The difference is that among races, attractiveness can still exist. It's not race-based discrimination, but I still think we should protect the freedoms of the employer. In that way, you also can reflect the freedoms of consumer and the individuals.
I think that's wrong and discriminatory, so I think you're overestimating the value of attractiveness in selling a product.
Depending on the job, different qualities of a person ascribe more value to the role. If I'm getting a job as an accountant, for example, I'm valued for my intelligence. I'm not valued for my attractiveness. For Abercrombie, the value of the position may be on the beauty.
What is the difference between attractiveness and race at the end of the day? Racial discrimination is something we've categorically worked against. However, what's the difference between me being a certain race and me having a facial scar that I was born with, for example? I mean, how is that any more arbitrary?
You can make the same argument about someone who's born with a mental disability. That person will never be hired as as an accountant.
What if you were just simply serving coffee, right? Should you be able to discriminate between somebody who can be a completely good service member but might have Down syndrome?
My argument would be if to the company the value of the service is decided on based on appearance, then they should be free to discriminate.
Okay, so secretaries, you're only going to hire hot secretaries?
I think the reason that Abercrombie is on the fence is because they're aligning themselves with the fashion industry, and I think that's why we tend to think, well, merit in that circumstance sort of includes what you look like.
I agree.
But I think when you start leaning towards flight attendants and secretaries, I think you get into sticky ground, because then you could say, well, let's not consider race, let's just talk about women. Like, women should be those because they're more, you know, welcoming, and they're more comfortable with conversing with people. And I think that's really, really dangerous. I think we have to draw the line somewhere.
I'm Diane. I've got 747s to Miami. Fly me. I'm Terry. I've got great connections in Miami, all over the Sunshine States of America. Me. I'm Marisa. I've got nonstop flights to Miami every day. Me.
Not too long ago, most airlines only hired attractive women with certain physical characteristics. The airlines argued that this is part of the qualification for the job. Our job is to maximize profits, and we make more money if we have women flight attendants. They called them stewardesses. Would you say, back in the day when the airlines made this argument, that being a physically attractive woman was a relevant qualification for being a flight attendant?
I think that you cannot deem somebody to be more qualified as an airline attendant based on what they look like.
So there should or should not be a law against airlines
There
hiring
should be a law against airlines.
against that.
Yeah.
Even if the airline, in its judgment, says, we will make more money this way.
Yes, because it's also about some kind of consumer sovereignty of saying, well, if I'm a woman, I should be able to look at attractive men. I mean,
I feel like here with the flight attendant case, it's clear-cut age discrimination. I mean, what happened over time is that the same flight attendants began getting fired because they got too old for the job, and that's clearly not okay, and that's already in our existing set of laws. We cannot discriminate based on age, which is linked to physical attraction, some say, so I completely agree with you.
And you agree that the airlines should not be able to fire a flight attendant based on age?
Right, I think there should be a law against
discrimination. And why should there be a law against age discrimination?
Because there's a huge set of negative externalities that come with that, and propagating those into our society, I think, is wrong. And I don't think
bad
that
attitudes?
Yes.
And so you think the law should try to shape and form good attitudes?
I think the law should not be discriminatory.
I think it's a very slippery slope what you're saying, because you say that, well, appearance is linked to age, but also like the capability to perform your job is linked to age. So should we like keep someone who's like 100 years old and can no longer serve in the airline just because there's like...
That's capability. That's a whole separate issue.
But it's linked
this
with
is
age,
just attraction.
Right?
We're just talking about attraction.
Both of them are linked with age, though. Both of them are linked with age.
There's a difference between measuring somebody based on their age because they can no longer perform a job and measuring somebody because they look old. I mean, that's a completely entirely different thing.
I think it's a fine line. I do think that people, in the end, have different assets, and everyone is going to end up at a different place.
We're saying if you're 6'5", absolutely drop-dead gorgeous and weigh about 2 stone, then you can go and become a model. That's what we're saying. We're saying that some people aren't like that, and
so
they should be able to go and work as a secretary and not be judged on what they look like.
Pan Am said explicitly at the time that we're doing this because this is what our customers prefer, and it's what we're doing to meet the demand, as it were, and to generate more revenue, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable business proposition.
What the customers prefer. But suppose some customers have bad preferences.
I have no idea about how to evaluate preferences. I try not to make those judgments.
But in the case of the airlines, now Pan Am, I think, said our customers want women flight attendants because they're more reassuring and soothing. But there were other airlines that said, we want female flight attendants and attractive ones. We're going to dress them in hot pants, and they will provide, in effect, sexual titillation. Now, suppose they really did get more customers. Is it a legitimate customer preference to want a scantily clad flight attendant on a flight?
I might think it was an odd preference, and I might not like it myself, but I wouldn't make that judgment in terms of having the government come in and intervene and say, this is legitimate, this is not legitimate. In practice, a lot of people would be turned off by scantily clad flight attendants. I doubt that that would be the sort of typical market equilibrium, but I wouldn't be intervening in terms of these different characteristics and preferences.
But those airlines carried on with it until the law and the courts said they couldn't.
I think that there would be a lot of people who would say that is completely unacceptable, much in the way that they say, I am not going to Hooters. And there would be airlines where they would have a diverse mix, male, female, different ages, different body types.
And they would compete in the market, and you're confident that the one with the diverse hiring practice would prevail.
What we're debating here is really about free choice and free will. The question about freedom or choice is much broader than just as a customer. It's more about as a citizen. Can I get a job? Can I get a house? Can I get a credit card? And that's where the government policy, I think, is important.
So if we're talking about employment, then it's wrong for the airlines to say you have to be a certain shapely woman to apply.
There will be an opportunity for that person to work in another environment. I mean, I lived in this country when you didn't see blacks or Latinos or Asians advertising products 15, 20 years ago. Now, I mean, it's a very, very diverse space. It's changed very quickly. So I have every faith that, yes, businesses, they absolutely value the diverse customer.
Our society has been defined by a long history of discrimination based on gender. And so types of discrimination, what the constitutional lawyers call suspect classifications, seem to me to be much more problematic.
The airlines argued at the time, we need to hire women and attractive ones. Our job is to maximize revenue, to attract passengers, and our passengers like flying on flights with attractive women, and that's why women were getting the jobs here, and the men were excluded.
That's true, but it is still a judgment based on a suspect classification. The airlines also emphasize that the primary mission of a flight attendant is safety, and in the absence of evidence that men were able to provide support for safety as effectively as women, a decision to exclude men would seem to me to be a problematic one. So that would not be a case where I would see great merit in their position in a society that is committed to civil rights and is committed to respect for all individuals in the workplace.
You have to look at why the desire for the airline to hire attractive people exists.
Right.
It was mostly businessmen flying, and they wanted to be served by attractive women. Now, most of us understand why that's extremely problematic. And we've decided as a society that it's not okay for you to only want to be served by someone of a certain gender or somebody who looks that way. And to you, Alex, what you said about like people have differences, some of the differences that we have claimed in our society are entirely of our own creation. Gender norms and norms about beauty are culturally and socially constructed. They are not natural.
So you're saying that the consumer preference of the male businessmen who flew a lot in the 1960s to be served by an attractive woman, that desire was morally illegitimate, and the law should try to discourage morally illegitimate preferences and desires.
Correct.
Do you agree, Lindsay?
I think that laws should be neutral and not be discriminatory. And for most of these cases that we've been talking about, the non-discriminatory solution was in markets, and this idea of liberal neutrality, which is that laws should not promote one moral code over another. In this case, I think that the policy itself set by the market is discriminatory, and the law should correct for that.
Nicole's point that societal views on gender have changed, and I would agree with that. If you only hired flight attendants based on their looks, that's going to be a poor decision because they're just not going to be able to perform their job. So in the end, in the long run, it will correct for itself.
But I think the reason that we now have different flight attendants, I think that's because we have more people flying. So the businesses have responded to consumer preferences, showing that it's not okay.
But they didn't need a law to do that.
Yes, they did. There were court cases that changed the law.
Sometimes there are changes in law that need to be made that are not profitable in markets, okay?
True.
Changing slavery was probably not profitable in the long run, but we deemed it to be immoral, and therefore we had a law that changed that. So I think sometimes you have to have a law which corrects for market discrimination, and in the case of flight attendants, I think that is important.
And it was the law that changed that. It was a court case that made that practice illegal. It's not a change in consumer preferences.
Let's say that the Abercrombie Fitch person who folds clothes and checks people out. What if their role was not only that, but also to be a model? To be a model of the clothes, of the brand.
And that's why I said, I think that's why we can perhaps let Abercrombie go on this.
And what if the stewardess was also a model of the brand by being attractive?
Is there any direct link between attractiveness and being able to fly through the sky to another destination? I don't think there is.
We were arguing earlier that in the 50s and 60s, flying on a plane was a luxury, and perhaps at that time, being an attractive stewardess was part of the product being sold. How is that different from having attractive clerks check you out?
In this particular case, hiring people with certain attractiveness is creating some kind of social norm and picture that is influencing the way we perceive ourselves and the way our children perceive themselves. And that is leading to serious social problems that include drugs addiction, alcoholism, and committing a suicide.
Eating disorders are
Eating
a huge
disorders.
So do you think we should just abolish modelling then? Do you think
I'm not sure of that.
I don't think you have to abolish modeling. I just think a different range of bodies.
Yeah.
Why is there one type of body that
So
we
you
deem
want, like,
socially acceptable?
But in the case of, for example, the Abercrombie Fitch model, the basis for their employment of the attractive person is because of the brand equity has real added value. If we're going to outlaw a company's ability to capitalize on brand equity, we're basically taking profits away from them.
The horror.
That doesn't bother you, Nicole.
No, it doesn't bother me.
But Josh said the point of a business is to make money, to make profits. And so shouldn't it be up to the business to decide what its essential purpose is, and therefore what qualifications, what merits are relevant?
I do not find profit alone to be a sufficient justification for discrimination.
What's wrong with that argument?
I do think it's hard for companies to completely eliminate looks from the category because that's what people see when they walk in the door.
What about, would you say the same about race?
No, I wouldn't.
Why?
I think that that's something different because race...
And it's enshrined in law, and it still happens implicitly.
I know that it still happens.
And the law is there for a reason, and we all think that there's a really good reason that
No,
it's
and
there.
I agree. I think the law is good, and I think it's great in this instance, but with regard to race, it's very easily quantifiable. With beauty, you can't legislate something that cannot be clearly defined.
Well, I don't
get into a
why would
gray
you not
area.
legislate something because it's difficult?
No, I'm not shying away because it's difficult. I'm shying away because the law needs to be able to define a line.
If we got to compete chain and we see that all of their employees are sexy, attractive, and hot, there will be something wrong with you if you don't figure out that there is a pattern there. We shall have stores that are open for everybody and do not discriminate anybody based on how they look.
So that's like saying let's have a shop that sells everything in the whole world
I'm not
for
saying that.
absolutely everybody.
I'm saying let's
That
have
is absolutely potty.
You are misunderstanding. You're misunderstanding me. I said there is something wrong with a shop that only hires attractive people. I think hiring people should be based on qualifications, not appearances.
We have made a distinction
But I
between
think
modeling and salesmanship.
But I think the distinction from modelling does include the stores. If I go into Abercrombie and I feel uncomfortable there, I'm not happy there, I just won't buy from there. However, if I want to fly to the other side of the world and I feel uncomfortable on all airplanes because everyone is small, I think that has more of a detrimental effect to me. I can still buy clothes elsewhere.
What will prevent all the rest of the clothing chains to follow this policy?
Demand.
Because
Consumer demand.
that doesn't prevail. If we look at the Abercrombie example, there was huge public outroar for about a day and a half when all these absurd comments were made. But sales are fine, so I don't think the market will take care of, I don't think consumer demand actually shifts that much.
Sometimes you have to say, like, no, we all agree that, like, there's something really unsavory about this, and it's not going to change unless something is done about it. Outrage hasn't worked. People still go there.
Plus, people are prevented from access to employment. There are people who are not getting jobs. In this case, it's not just about particular options for branding. It's about people who aren't getting jobs in the service sector, which is the fastest growing sector in our economy.
Alex, would you make the same argument with regard to a lunch counter in the American South that didn't serve African Americans on the grounds that most of our customers are white segregationists and don't want to eat in a lunch counter or in a restaurant that has African Americans?
I mean, I do believe that the problem with, like, discrimination based on race is much bigger.
How is it different?
Let him answer.
You can change your appearance.
Really?
Disagree.
All right, one possible difference is the one Josh just suggested, that it has to do with whether the characteristic is immutable or not. Josh, you think that immutable characteristics are illegitimate bases, whereas changeable ones are acceptable?
Exactly. For example, I have an earring. I have a piercing in my left ear.
Yeah.
When I go to a job interview, I do not wear my earring because I don't want others' perception tainting whether or not I get the job, because my appearance is changeable in that respect. I wouldn't wear shorts and a t-shirt to a job interview.
Josh, let's examine reason by reason a possible basis for distinguishing lookism in employment from racism. What about religion? No Catholics or Jews need apply. Now, you can change your religion.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting... it's definitely a different situation because it is changeable. But at the same time, it's something that's so emotionally charged.
Appearance is emotionally charged as well. Why should I have to change the way I look?
Your religion doesn't change the way, how you can perform a job.
But the issue is whether what counts as a legitimate basis for hiring is based on what's immutable or is based on what is relevant to performing the job. Alex, what do you think about that?
I definitely think that there should be anti-discriminatory laws regarding race.
Based on race?
Yeah.
And so how would you articulate the principal distinction between laws preventing racism in employment and laws preventing lookism?
Race is something that you have no control over, like absolutely no control. And you can be of a different race and still be like beautiful. Like, I don't know, I don't understand why it even should be a concern when it comes down to employment.
But suppose that restaurant in the segregationist South says, if we have African-American waiters or customers in here, we will do less business because our clientele is segregationist and they won't eat here. Why should the law prevent that business from making that decision to maximize its profits?
I would interpret it almost as like a violation of the freedoms of the African-American people in that place. And it's based on something that they cannot control. Like, I don't understand why it wouldn't be like a violation.
And if someone is
rights.
homely or ugly by Abercrombie's standard and therefore can't get a job, are they in any more control of their looks?
It's much harder to change your race than to change your looks overall. Like, one is
and
impossible,
that's
the other one is possible.
The basis for distinguishing the laws? Remember, if it's mutability, then religion, it's all right to discriminate on the basis of religion in hiring?
I guess we think of looks as something much more superficial than religion or race, whereas I really don't see it in equal terms. Like, to me, like, religion and race are much more defining of a characteristic of a person.
Some would say the reason attitudes have changed with regard to race is precisely because the Civil Rights Act took a public stand saying you can't do that.
I think it probably would have worked out better in terms of civil rights if we hadn't had the kinds of interventions in the 1960s that we did have, which are generally quite applauded. Now, I admit that in the South in the 1950s, 1960s, things would have been different. And there, probably some businesses could have followed those practices and not be driven out of business. So things have changed because of attitudes have changed. That makes these anti-discrimination laws even less necessary in terms of the modern period.
But you point, Robert, to attitudes changing, and you think for the better.
Yes, I think.
So you do have a view about good attitudes and bad attitudes, desirable and undesirable customer preferences, and yet you still think the Civil Rights Act was a mistake.
I have a notion in my own head about attitudes that I find more or less attractive, and therefore people who have different attitudes, I would find them more or less appealing to deal with myself. But I think that's my own individual preference, which I would express in the marketplace in terms of, for example, not wanting to visit a hotel that had a sign that said, no blacks admitted here, or something analogous to that. And I think other people have these kinds of preferences, and I think that has a lot of bearing on what businesses find desirable to do. So this will typically not be attractive for a business to have this kind of overt discrimination.
Why wouldn't you want the law to say to these companies, you can't discriminate on these bases in hiring? Why wouldn't you want to do that?
I'm not saying I wouldn't want them to do that, but I do think that what we have seen is that there is a natural transition to that pluralist world without the need for government regulation.
In the case of gender, but not in the case of race. Why is that, do you think?
I put gender and race in the same category. What I'm talking about is lookism, which I think is slightly different.
The market will solve lookism.
I do think so, yeah.
Not necessarily sexism or racism.
Correct. Because I think there's something quite objective about looks, where I think it is something very subjective about gender and race.
No one is entitled to a job that they don't deserve. No one's entitled to look good. But I do believe that people are entitled to practice a religion. So mutability as well as individual freedom needs to be considered in this moral question.
Why isn't it individual freedom to appear the way I want to appear?
Well, but you cannot force it upon others to accept it.
We're allowing differences in individual private conduct. You don't necessarily have to date somebody who you do not find attractive.
Yeah.
However, in hiring, in the public sphere, that's a different area.
I want to go back to Nicole. Now, you heard Josh and Alex try to give a principled distinction between preventing discrimination based on race and preventing discrimination based on looks. You don't distinguish those two cases. You're for banning both forms of discrimination.
Correct.
On the grounds that both cater to morally illegitimate desires. Alex and Josh, why do you disagree with Nicole's reason? Don't you think that in both cases, the preferences being catered to are morally illegitimate?
That's more a matter of like personal morality. It should I don't believe it should be in any way like embodied in law. Like
you're also putting people at fault for liking someone else who's attractive.
Only in the public sphere with businesses and hiring.
Why should a company bear the responsibility and bear the costs of lost profits because of the immorality of the consumer's preferences?
I'm saying that maybe there are certain things that companies shouldn't profit off of.
Take another kind of job about which there's been a controversy over discrimination in employment, Hooters. Do you know what those restaurants are, anybody? Jamie?
I've never been to Hooters. Basically, they're a pub. All of their waitresses are scantily clad and meet physical specifications, and so men enjoy to be served by these women.
And some women.
And some women are turned down from the opportunity to work just because they don't have the requisite breast size.
Well, so the market's going to find a different place for them.
You can say the
market's
same
going
thing
to find a
about
different
the
place
race.
for the black person
Yeah,
who wants to apply
exactly.
for the southern restaurant.
Actually, I don't necessarily agree with this, because if it's a norm that's perpetuated like all across society, that person actually might be left without a job. Whereas if a woman doesn't have like the necessary like physical structure or breast size, and she cannot work in that specific restaurant, she can still go and work in another service or industry.
There was a suit brought by a man who applied to be a waiter at Hooters, and no men are hired as waiters. And he claimed this was unjust discrimination. What do you think about that one, Josh? Does he have a case?
In that case, I think that's more objectionable because of the fact that it's gender and sex discrimination as opposed to an appearance.
But you can change your sex.
You can change your sex.
But what if I like it the way I am? This is against my freedom. This is against my liberty.
Against my
But no one's
identity.
forcing you to do
Okay,
it.
say we actually impose on this restaurant to actually hire men. Then they lose like half of their clientele because more men are going to stop going there. But say if that whole business shuts down, your social pie is shrinking.
Maybe it's worth it to have a smaller social pie and a nicer population.
And live like in a super idealistic world with like
Everybody
no pie.
knows
so
how these women are objectified. Everybody knows how they're
And again,
treated.
I'll go.
It still
Have you ever
continues.
asked women how they feel to work there?
I've read court cases.
You've read court cases, but you do not know in the aggregate or the sum total. It is probably in the worst interest of that company to
They've been around
to hire.
for like
You can't
solely
count on
that
that
one
for social
event
change.
company,
You can't.
Ryan, do you agree with Nicole that the consumer preference to which Hooters is catering is morally objectionable?
I would say it's pretty morally objectionable to go to a restaurant simply because you think that the waitresses are attractive.
But that's not a sufficient reason.
That's not a
to
sufficient
make it
reason
against
to
the law.
ban them. I wouldn't make
All
a
right,
law
and
against
Well,
them.
do you think it's discriminatory to not hire someone based on their gender?
The man who applied to Hooters and was turned down, I think he should have known that Hooters was going to turn him down.
So you think he should have known that this institutionalized practice of discrimination would have occurred?
Just like that
Yes.
black person should have
And-
known not to apply to the
Yeah.
restaurant in the White South.
It is difficult. I understand.
Oh, yeah.
It is difficult.
With the gender and race, I think there's a problem with not hiring a man. But I don't think there's as much of a problem not hiring a woman with big enough breasts. Because one is appearance and the other is what someone is born with.
But you don't think
These
there's
are
any...
both fundamental appearances that you're born with. And yes, you can change these physical appearances either way. But just
it's more
because
difficult to change
Yes.
than when Josh takes out his earring for a job.
For those who are vehemently opposed to employment based on looks or appearance, what about qualities that are similar, like intelligence? You cannot drastically increase your intelligence to beyond a certain limit.
If the differences in equity are made up in social benefit, for example, giving better opportunities for somebody who's intelligent for larger social gains, that's justifiable.
But how
However,
is
if
it
it is
different?
simply
Because it
just for
benefits
more
the
profits
least
for one
well-off
business because they
person.
want to cater to sexist clientele, that's a little bit different than having somebody who's most intelligent being a better doctor.
Yeah.
All right, Josh, how do you answer these questions?
I think there's a distinction here that we haven't made explicit. The difference between a consumer and employer preferences. So in this case, the consumer is having these preferences. And in the case of whether or not we find it morally objectionable for an employer to discriminate, it's an employer.
I have to disagree with you against here, because eventually what the employer wants to do is to satisfy the consumer so he gets good profit. So in both cases, it's the exact same thing, whether it's consumer or employer. It's just going from the other way around.
Let's assume that in each case, the employer is not independently racist or sexist or enamored of beautiful-looking people, but simply responding to consumer preferences, trying to maximize profit. Which of those customer preferences are morally legitimate for the business to cater to? When should the law intervene to prevent labor markets from expressing or responding to certain preferences of consumers? Some of you have drawn distinctions between sexism, lookism, and racism. Now, one approach to these questions is to say discrimination is bad. Discrimination is wrong, it's unfair. But as we've looked closely at these cases, all of them in a way involve discrimination. Whenever an employment decision is made, strictly speaking, that's discrimination. So we've been debating what are legitimate grounds for discrimination. And that's driven us to harder questions about what is the legitimate purpose of a business and what are morally legitimate consumer preferences, which suggests that the question of the role of markets in hiring and employment, figuring that out, forces us to confront sometimes controversial conceptions of the good, of the worthy, of the legitimate preferences that customers bring to markets.